Bonjour à vous toutes et tous. Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Center for Language and Cultural Contact at Glendon College, York University, I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar on Michel Tremblay's Plays in Scots. I would also like to extend my warmest thanks to our guests, Martin Bowman, the translator, Jane Kustas, Janusz Przychodzeń, and Nicole Nollet, who will be moderating the discussion. So now let me introduce Nicole Nollet before giving her the floor. Nicole is the Canada Research Chair in Minority Studies and Associate Professor in the Department of French Studies at the University of Waterloo, here in Ontario. Her first book, Joual, traduction, théâtre et hétérolinguisme au Canada francophone, published in 2015, received the Anne Sadelmeyer Award from the Canadian Association for Theatre Research in 2016, and another award for the best work in theatre for 2014-2016 from the Société québécoise d'études théâtrales. Her second book, Traversée Toronto, Récits urbains de traduction théâtrale, is forthcoming with the University of Montreal Press. Thank you again for being here, and over to you, Nicole. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you very much for this invitation to moderate this webinar on Michel Tremblay's Plays in Scots. As Aurelia said, I am Nicole Nollet, and I am at the University of Waterloo. So much of my work takes place on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. So the main campus of the University of Waterloo is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. Today's webinar is about a 2-volume set of translations by Martin Bowman and Bill Findlay of 8 plays by Michel Tremblay translated from the vernacular French of Montreal into contemporary urban Scots. Between 1989 and 2003, these translations received professional productions in major theatres in Scotland, and several of them toured beyond Scotland to Montreal, Toronto, New York State, and London. Michel Tremblay's plays found a second home in Scots, emphasizing the political and cultural resonance between Quebec and Scotland. Unlike most translations of plays into Scots, these scripts are not adaptations. Keeping the plays in their original setting, the translators set out to show that a play in Scots does not have to be set in Scotland or have Scottish characters. In addition to editing these scripts for the publication, so these books, Volume 1 and Volume 2, Martin Bowman has provided 10 introductory essays, 1 to each volume as a whole, and 1 to each of the 8 scripts. These introductions document the success in Scotland of Michel Tremblay, and in so doing provide a comprehensive look into collaborative translation and the use of vernacular languages in translations for the theatre. So I am very pleased to see that Martin Bowman is now here and that I can introduce him and our 2 other guests today. Born in Montreal of Scottish parents, Martin Bowman is a theatre translation specializing in vernacular languages. He holds an MA in English literature from McGill University and a PhD from the Université de Montréal. While completing his PhD research at the School of Scottish Studies at Edinburgh University, he met Bill Findlay. They decided to translate Michel Tremblay's play Les Belles Sœurs, and then 10 years passed before the translation received a professional production directed by Michael Boyd at the Tron Theatre in Glasgow in 1989. Bowman and Findlay went on to translate another 7 plays by Michel Tremblay, who became for a time the most frequently produced contemporary playwright in Scotland. They also translated 3 plays by other Quebec playwrights, including Jeannance Delisle. And on his own, Martin also translated into Scots Delisle's Un oiseau vivant dans la gueule. With Wajdi Mouawad, he co-translated into French Henry Gibson's dramatic adaptation of the novel Trainspotting. In 2007, he was awarded the Medal of the Faculty of Arts and Science by the Université de Montréal in recognition of his contribution to Quebec culture internationally through theatre translations. In 2023, Michel Tremblay Plays in Scots, containing the 8 translations of Michel Tremblay by Bowman and Findlay, was published in these 2 volumes that we're talking about today by the Association for Scottish Literature in Glasgow. So today we'll have Martin speak for around 30 minutes, and then we'll open up the discussion to our 2 other speakers who will respond for approximately 10 minutes. And then we'll open up this discussion to the audience in the chat for questions and answers. But I'll start by introducing our other guests before having Martin speak. Jane Custas is one of our guests. She is a professor emerita in the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures at Brock University in St. Catharines, Ontario, where she also directed Canadian Studies. She served as the Craig Dobbin Professor of Canadian Studies at University College Dublin. She currently serves as the president of the International Council for Canadian Studies. Professor Custas's research interests include English-Canadian literature and translation, translation theory and practice, translation history in Canada, Quebec and Irish theater, and theater translation. In 2017, she was granted the James A. Flaherty visiting professorship to pursue a comparative study of Quebec and Irish literature. Professor Custas was awarded the Governor General's Award for International Canadian Studies in 2022. Our second guest, or other guest, is Janusz Przychodyn, who obtained his PhD from McGill University and was granted postdoctoral fellowships at the University of California at Berkeley and the University of Toronto. In 2007, he began his academic career at York University. He's the author of 3 monographs on literary theory and Quebec literature. He's co-edited and edited 9 books on the aesthetics and poetics of ordinary language from a transdisciplinary perspective, on Quebec literature and social discourse analysis. He has contributed numerous book chapters, articles in peer-reviewed journals, dictionary and encyclopedia entries. He's also presented papers internationally, given guest speeches in North America, South America, Europe, and Asia, and led SSHRC-funded research projects. His research expertise includes Canada-Asia intercultural relations, as well as the imaginary of the Americas and the Caribbean. So, are we ready to start this conversation? Martin, I don't know if you can turn your camera on.
First of all, thanks very much for the invitation, everyone. Thank you. It's a pleasure to see you. I disappeared because I have a very unstable connection, so, but thank you, Nicole.
Hopefully you'll be there the whole time. So perhaps, Martin, can you turn your camera and microphone on?
Yeah. Hello? Can you hear me?
We can hear you. We can't see you, but we can hear you.
I don't know how to turn the camera on. I'd start my video. Maybe it starts. I'm there. Hi. At last.
Yes, hi. Nice to meet you.
You too, Nicole. Very nice to meet you. And I'll just get going. But first, I want to thank Aurelia for organizing this event, and also to thank Janusz and Jane for participating, and of course to you also for moderating the event today. I'm very grateful to Glendon College, York University, the Translation Studies program, for their interest, which from the moment they heard about this well over a year have been enthusiastic and welcoming. So I'll begin now. I've got about half an hour. You can cut me off whenever you want, but I'm going to start off by reading something that takes about 3 minutes, and then I'll be ad lib talking about everything. And this is because when people see the titles of these books, before we get to anything to do with how it all happened, Michel Tremblay Plays in Scots, there is often a misapprehension about what Scots is. Particularly in Canada, I find that people are unaware of it and think of it perhaps that it's Gaelic, which is, of course, one of the other Indigenous languages of Scotland. So I'm just going to begin with a sort of prose poem, somewhat ironic, about what Scots language is, which I hope will put it on the map for anybody who may not be exactly sure. What is Scots? Scots is a Germano-French language, the product of invasions of the island of Great Britain in and about the 5th and 11th centuries. The same can be said for English. By the 13th century, the people of the lowlands of Scotland were speaking Middle Scots. For a time, they called it Ingles, but to differentiate the language from the language spoken to the south, they began to call it Scottish, now known as Scots. By the 13th century, the people of England were speaking Middle English. The gradual development of Middle English into modern English concluded sometime in the 15th century, about a century before Shakespeare was born. In 2023, approximately 1.5 billion people speak English. In 2023, approximately 1.5 million people speak Scots. What happened? In 1560, John Knox, a Scot, founded the Presbyterian Church of Scotland. He had spent much of his life in exile because of his zealous Protestantism. He spent some time at the English court, where he served as royal chaplain to the king. Later, he was one of the authors of the Geneva Bible, which is in English. He brought this Bible with him back to Scotland. Within decades, there would be a law requiring all households in Scotland over a certain income to have a copy of this English Bible. God, it turned out, was an Anglophone. In 1603, Elizabeth, Queen of England, died without issue. Her cousin, King James VI of Scotland, inherited the English crown. Up until this date, the countries of Scotland and England had different monarchs. James immediately went to London and never returned to Scotland. He was responsible for the King James Version of the Bible, recognized as one of the most beautifully written books in English. James, it turned out, was an Anglophile. In 1707, another 100 years on, the Scottish Parliament went bankrupt because of corruption among the nobility, who were, of course, the members of the Parliament. And the Parliament was bought out by the English Parliament, even though most Scots were against the Union. The Scottish nobility, it turned out, was a gang of scoundrels. As Robert Burns has written, "We're bought and sold for English gold. What a parcel of rogues in a nation." And he's not referring to the English there when he says that. Between 1651 and 1822, no Scottish monarch set foot in Scotland. Almost 150 years. All of these events and others, of course, contributed to Scotland becoming an English-speaking country, displacing Scots and Gaelic as the language of business and government. The Scottish Parliament reconvened in 1999 after almost 300 years of adjournment. The Parliament recognized Scots as an indigenous language of Scotland. Scots is recognized as a regional or minority language of Europe and a vulnerable language by UNESCO. So I hope that sets everybody straight on exactly where all this has come from. It's not exactly sure when Scotland would have been described as an English-speaking country, but it's not that long ago. It's interesting that the languages referred to as indigenous, Gaelic and Scots, in fact, are languages that extirpated the indigenous languages that were there before they came into the island of Great Britain. So let me begin. Bill Findlay and I decided immediately upon meeting that we would translate Michel Tremblay into Scots. We were both doing PhDs in John Galt, the Scottish writer and Canadian colonist, and we were invited by our advisors to meet to make sure we weren't treading on the same academic territory. We weren't. We went out and Bill quickly said, I don't know why it was so fast, but he said, "Do you think there's a play we can translate from Quebec into Scots?" And I immediately said, "Yes, Les Berceurs by Michel Tremblay." I chose that play intuitively because of its importance in Quebec theater history, a groundbreaking event when it premiered in 1968 at the Théâtre de l'Univers in Montreal, because it brought Montreal working class people onto the stage speaking the way they would speak at home. In other words, the vernacular language of Montreal, often called and intermittently called joual, which of course some may know is the pronunciation of the word in the dialect from the country that came into Montreal. It's the way the word cheval, horse, is pronounced. So we have joual. We have a language which is working class. It's I suppose an urban dialect of French, and we have in Scotland in the same period about 1.5 million people speaking Scots, also in a condition of impoverishment, reduction, and for very different reasons. No one recognizes joual as a language. Scots is recognized as a language because it has a very rich literary history going back to medieval times, and it finds itself now in a position of being threatened. Really, in a way, it's quite possible that what Bill Findlay and I did in translating these plays was a kind of curatorial act, not that we saw it that way, but it's been described that way. Here, people will be able to see what the state of Scots was in the second half of the 20th century, if it continues to lose its foothold in its country. It took us 10 years for the Les Berceurs, called the Guid Sisters in Scots, to be produced. And in these 10 years, we had a lot of waiting and occasional moments where it looked like it might get to be known. And none of this would have happened, none of this being the Tremblay phenomenon in Scotland. None of this would have happened if it had not been for an extraordinary act of chance. Bill Findlay read an article about a visit of Michel Tremblay to Edinburgh, and he had missed his chance to go, but he contacted the journalist who had written about Tremblay's visit to Edinburgh. This is long before the translations were known and after the Guid Sisters had been translated. And that person, the journalist, was contacted by Bill, and he learned that her father was a professor of French at Stirling University who was keenly interested in Quebec theater and film. And so Bill contacted Ian Lockerbie, the professor of French, and very soon a relationship was struck up because Ian was extremely interested in the existence of the Guid Sisters, which he would never have found out about had his daughter not been a journalist, et cetera, et cetera. The Tremblay phenomenon in Scotland was truly remarkable. I would suggest that it's one of the most astonishing bodies of work of translation of plays anywhere in the world. And Michel Tremblay became a Scottish playwright. They talked about the Tremblay phenomenon in Scotland. They called him Mick Tremblay. They said he was the best playwright Scotland never had. They claimed a major contribution to Scottish theatre. All of this very astonishing to the two translators, who had never translated anything before they translated the Guid Sisters, and had never done anything about translation theory or whatever. We were complete novices. But I must say that from the conception of the project, and this is very important, we were translation activists. We were political. We knew what we were doing about the Scots language. We knew that we wanted to advance its use in present-day Scotland. We knew also, Bill particularly with his expertise in the field, he knew that there had never been translation of a contemporary play in Scots, and we also decided that we were not going to adapt the play to Scotland. There was some history of translation of theatre for Scotland, but mostly it was Molière and Goldoni, and almost always, or Greek plays, for example. But almost always they were adapted to Scottish scenes. The usual thing of calling the character, MacDonald or whatever, and really changing the whole situation. Well, I'm a Quebecer, I'm a Montrealer, and I could not imagine effacing Montreal and Quebec culture and everything that's in those plays of Tremblay by adapting it into Scots. And Bill also wanted to make the same point, that Scots would challenge the maturity of the Scottish audience insofar as they would now have to see a play that was obviously not in Scotland and yet was in Scots. The language is live enough and strong enough to be a target language that does not demand adaptation into the culture. And that, to me, is the most important thing that we set out to achieve. And we were extremely fortunate with Les Belles Sœurs, because it's absolutely in its time, 1965, it's in its place, and there are 15 characters on stage and many other characters mentioned, and they all have glorious Quebecois names, and they frequently call each other by these names. So there's an endless echoing throughout the translation of the Quebecois names, never mind the cultural aspects as well that would have had to been adapted to Scotland. There is no doubt about it that when you watch the Guid Sisters, you can't miss that it is a Quebecois play. Some of you who know the Guid Sisters, Les Belles Sœurs, will know the famous speech by Yvette Lompré, which consists of 57 names, all of them Quebecois names, and these names are still there in the Scots translation. And in fact, when it was first produced, I coached the actor who was playing the role in giving all of the names a Quebecois pronunciation as opposed to a French pronunciation, so that the actual sounds of Quebec, joual, French, call it what you will, were heard on the stage. The other thing that's been noted about these translations by many people is the happy accident of a number of cultural resonances, we could call them, between Scotland and Quebec. Some of these are very obvious. One of them is that they are, in the sense of the world, they're small countries. They have this common sense of them being small. Tremblay himself, in his memoir about the books that he read, talks about himself as being in a small country, of being right from the get-go colonized and a cultural victim. He even uses that phrase in that book. So it's this issue of the margin versus the center, which is a key thing in the way of looking at these plays. The two plays are vibrant cultures. They are, however, on the margin, and they live near some very big centers. Scotland lives near England, Quebec lives near the United States, France in a way, and the rest of Canada, for example. The other thing about these two cultures is they have a vibrant vernacular language. And these languages are sociolinguistically identical. They're spoken, at least the urban variety of Scots is spoken in the same way as joual. And joual originally was a rural language that came in, a rural dialect rather, that came into Montreal at the time of the industrialization in the early 20th century. Well, what can we say about these vernacular languages? They are both perceived as incomplete. I have to say, and there's no regret involved in this. These are just a factual thing about the state of the Scots language now. Most Scots speakers speak Scots simultaneously with English. Now, of course, there's a great a great body of vocabulary that's the same in the two languages, given their origins, which I mentioned at the beginning. But many Scots speakers will say something in Scots, and then they will, for emphasis, say it in English, or they will do it the other way around. Scots is a very inconsistent language in the way that it's spoken, because of the influence of English. And many Scots speakers would be surprised to know that Scots is a language, that they're speaking the ancient language of Scotland, when they're speaking the way they do, especially among the working class speakers. Scots and joual are, to quote the first reviewers of Les Belles Sœurs and the first reviewers of the Guid Sisters, there's something monstrous and vulgar about these languages. Pas selon moi, but that's what was what was said in the quite extraordinary reviews of rejection. One of our rejection reviews said, it's hard to believe, and surely it's not the case, that the Quebecois women sound as vulgar in French as they do in Scots. So that's an affinity of language that made our translations live in the same way as Tremblay's original play lived. We had that resource of vulgarity. We had that resource of anger and humor that seemed to live in vernacular languages. So that was another very special part of the whole procedure. Then there's the obvious political affinity. It's sort of extraordinary to me that my two places, Quebec and Scotland, as I grew up in Quebec, and of course I also grew up in Scotland at the same time, because there was a very strong Scottish community in Montreal when I was a child. But the idea that these two countries, or these two states or provinces or nations, it's all a very delicate business of how you describe them. They both have had independence movements in the last 30 or 40 years, and independence in Quebec and independence in Scotland are still on the spoken about and part of the political life of both countries. So that's another element that's quite telling. Tremblay himself, in his early plays, he was never outwardly political, but there are ways of seeing the political message of Quebec independence, particularly in the Guid Sisters and Forever Yours, Marie-Lou, and Hosanna, for three of his earliest plays. Other cultural affinities, well, there's an affinity of religion, which is an interesting thing, because we would wonder how the Roman Catholic elements of Tremblay would survive in a place like Glasgow, where you think of Scotland as mostly a Protestant country, but there is a very vibrant Catholic-speaking minority in Glasgow and in other Scottish cities. So that transfer is very easy also. And the other thing, Linda Gaborio, who many of you I know must know very well, and certainly realize that she's one of the preeminent translators of Quebec literature into English. She was talking about translating Tremblay and other Quebec writers, and saying that the one thing that's really challenging for her, for me, as she was saying, is that in all of these writers, particularly a writer like Tremblay and others you could name, there is another character. There's always another character, and that other character is the language, and the language is celebrated in these plays. The language themselves in these minority environments, and the sense of pride in oneself and in one's culture. So there's a living language that is there as a character. That's true in the Tremblay plays. It's very true in the Scots translations. It was another reason why all of these things came together to make a perfect marriage of, or not to have, this is a mixed metaphor, but they're once described as long lost twins, these Scots language and the joual. Now, when it comes to the actual nitty-gritty of the translation of these plays, I'll talk about the challenges of translating Tremblay into Scots as Bill and I have discussed at great length, and there's a massive amount of information about this in the books because I quoted Bill's letters copiously because he was so thoughtful and he was so nuanced and so detailed about everything. The 8 plays we translated cover 30 years of Michel Tremblay's career, from his first plays to 1998, when he produced his memoir of his mother, Encore une fois, si vous permettez, which in our translation has a completely different title. And in those 30 plays, we have a range of, throughout the 30 years of you can say that if you look at the Scots Tremblays, you can have a real sense of the achievement of Tremblay as a whole, despite the fact that it's only 8 of more than 40 plays that he has written that we were able to translate. So we have in these 8 plays, we have periods from 1910 to 1990. We have speakers who are rural. We have speakers who are urban. We have speakers who speak Scottish English because they're well educated and they no longer speak Scots, and that have to be dealt with when you come to the actual translation of the theater. The plays themselves are going to live on a stage, and they're going to be spoken. So that it's not a question of written text, but it's a and how do you differentiate between these different people when you get a play where you've got people who are of ages from 20 to 60 who are not related familiarly, some of whom have moved up in the world in terms of their employment, others who have not. You have in Solemn Mass for a Full Moon in Summer, for example. I'm giving you the title that we use for our translation, obviously. You have 6 different stories told simultaneously with characters who all speak in different registers. It's an extraordinarily intricate business to create a Scots play with characters who are contemporary because of the nature of the inconsistency of Scots language in itself. But with the one play, The House Among the Stars, La Maison Suspendue, which has 3 sets of characters, one in 1910 in the country, one in 1950 in urban Montreal, and one in 1990, by which time the character, all of them related, it's a family story, is a lecturer in a university in Montreal. So you've got so many different varieties of language to deal with in the course of making the translation. In this case in particular, Bill translated each time separately, even though the 3 of them are totally interwoven all the time. All the characters are on the stage at the same time, walking past one another from 1950 to 1910, and so on, in this remarkable play, La Maison Suspendue. So we have the question of, beyond that, the question in what dialect to use. Scots language rather, is a language without a standard. We talk about standard English, we talk about standard French, we talk about the dialects of English, but in the case of Scots, there is no standard. There are only dialects. There are dialects all over the country. There are urban dialects and rural dialects, very different one from the other. You can travel 50 miles away from one place to the next, and the sound of the Scots speaking English sounds different because they have a different accent in that way. So when you translate a play, what dialect are you going to use? Glasgow would be the obvious choice for industrial working class plays. However, there are many other places in Scotland that could be also candidates for this kind of translation. Bill himself came from the east coast of Scotland. My parents came to the county north of where he came from, east coast, and we would like to imagine these plays could be done in that dialect too. Now, am I running out of time? How am I doing on time? Okay.
5 more minutes.
Okay. A few more minutes? Okay. So other complications in terms of the challenges of translating Tremblay, deciding on a dialect, deciding on something which Bill sort of invented. He went for a non-regional Scots in some of the plays. Now, there's no such thing as a non-regional Scots out in Scotland, but he made a theatrical language, which is something that Tremblay also did. It's been noted about Tremblay's characters that they are not actually speaking exactly the way people speak in Montreal. He's created a theatrical language for them. We were able to create a theatrical language in our plays, and the problems was the critics who expected it to be in a Glasgow accent, and they would hear something and they would say, "Oh, the translation's not as good as the last one because it's." But then Bill would write a riposte to the critics and explain exactly what he was doing, and that all that information is also found in the books. There are also two plays which are very musical in their form. Albertine 5 Times and Solemn Mass for a Full Moon in Summer. Not that the others were lacking in music, but they're very musical in form, and this had to be dealt with in a very particular way. Albertine en cinq temps, Albertine in 5 Times, was the sixth of the plays that we translated. We did not translate them in any chronological order, and Bill decided that he would actually put a note about language in the sixth play, because he was spelling out to the actors exactly how to pronounce every word, and also pointing out to them that the same word will be perhaps pronounced differently in the same sentence, depending on the way in which the speaker, because the real speakers of Scots are all over the place with how they use the language, and they use it in a very exotic and exciting way, not just the combination of English and Scots. So that had to be done. And if you look at Albertine 5 Temps, when they talk about it, and critics talk about that play, they do observe it as being almost like a musical score. Tremblay had, the details are so exact, not only as to do with what's said, but also to do with the silences. If I'm not mistaken, I've got the real number in the book. There are 47 moments in the play where they are silenced, and I counted the silent moments in all 8 of the translations, and Albertine has many, many, many more silences. So you get and then in Solemn Mass you have the challenge of vernacular, and you have the challenge of speeches all at the same time and repeated and interwoven, just as if they were some sestet from a Rossini opera, where everybody's saying something different at the same time. And in a play, they're speaking and they're saying it at the same time. And you also have the question of the appropriate language for religious discourse, as opposed to the arguments between the people. And here's a big problem for a Scottish translator, because the only thing you can use is English. And for Bill and me, one of the disasters was in the production of the Solemn Mass, which was very, very good indeed, and successful, as all the translations were amazingly. 2 of the actors ended up speaking. They were English speakers. They were upper class, middle class, and they were English speakers. And they ended up in the production speaking with an English accent. And this was for us something that we would wish to avoid. We expected that they would speak English with a Scottish accent, so these kind of details that we didn't control enough in our notes and so on about the plays. Spelling I've already covered, of course, by being. Bill was always precise to the very end. He never trusted his Scots actors to not go into their own Scots when he had an idea exactly of what should be said in this text. So, because there was a moment in the rehearsals for the Guid Sisters where 15 women, right? It's a fabulous play with all these women, 15 characters for women, and there was a discussion about some phrase, and somebody said, whatever the word was, my gran never says that. My grandmother never says that. And another one chirped out, my gran always says that. My grandmother always says that. So every Scot who speaks thinks that they're the final expert on what is Scots and what isn't, in a world of very lively dialectal differences. And if oh, I've lost you. Uh-oh.
Have you lost us on your screen?
No, I lost the screen, but there you are.
Okay.
Still hear me?
Yes, I do.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, have I got 2 minutes?
Sure, 2 minutes.
Okay, 2 minutes. I think I've covered everything, and if I haven't, the questions and that will probably, I've just been going on a bit, and let me see if I can find what I wanted to do, or maybe I don't need the 2 minutes.
In the meantime, maybe I can say that one of the great things about these introductions, and we hear it in your in this talk that you're giving, is this conversation between you and Bill Findlay. And because we have we have this incredible access to the correspondence between you and him in the introductions, it's a really great look into the collaborative process for theater translation that you enacted.
Well, it was an extraordinary thing in the collaboration. Two strangers meet. The empathy was total. We never argued. We debated a great. See, I came with my own Scots. My parents spoke Scots growing up in Verdun, and so I was certainly putting in my 2 cents worth all the time. We'd have these long conversations. I've found what I'd like to read. It'll take about 2 minutes. It's a passage from the book to try to. What I'm trying to say here is that this work was for us was a creative act of literature. These translations, this is how we perceived it, and we were part of it. We couldn't help but, as much as we had to acknowledge, and I haven't done it enough in this speech, the greatness of Michel Tremblay's plays, because I've been talking about the translation, and why did they succeed in Scotland? Number one, they're brilliant plays. Many of them are masterpieces, and we were so grateful to him. So I'll just read this, and this will be the end of my talk. The extraordinary, this is from the second volume, talking about the house among the stars. The extraordinary achievement of Michel Tremblay is evident in this story he tells in such multitudinous, wonderful ways of his people. This is perhaps the reconciliation that he was aiming for in this play, La Maison Suspendue, even more than the patching up of the rancorous relationship of Edouard and Albertine. It is understanding the wholeness of the story of a person, of a family, of a country, and the way in which that history becomes something greater, something complete and universal. Such a story is full of horrors and wonders as well as all the ordinary things that make a life. Bill and I both felt that our own stories were somehow part of this. We felt that very intensely, including the loss of older Scots language. I could hear it in the voices of my parents, Jean Scott of Manicky and Jack Bowman of Forfar. As the baron of the family, I heard it daily when I was growing up, and virtually every Saturday night through the year when I was taken to a party of my parents' Scots-speaking friends in Verdun in faraway Canada. I did not get to Scotland until I was 21 years old, and apart from a distant cousin who visited once, I had never met a relative beyond my parents or siblings. That was what emigration meant in those days before air travel was affordable. And then I was in Scotland with my Uncle Will and Motherwell, meeting cousins for the first time. And then in the East, where I met my Angus folk, Uncle Fred at the Kellis, who was a monolingual Scots speaker, and his sister, my Auntie Meg, living in Broughty Ferry, who would mutter, "Affy course," when Fred would tell one of his stories. And Uncle Adam in Letham, and all the cousins in Carnoustie and Teeling, in Forfar and Letham, in Kirkcaldy and Dundee, the Hale Clanjamfrey. And a shock went through me there in Angus when I realized I could hear the Canadian in my parents' voices when in Canada I'd always heard them as Scottish. But there I was in Angus, and I could hear the loss when compared to the uneroded language of my uncles, aunts, and cousins. It was Catherine Lockerbie, who was the person who brought us all together in the first place, who understood why the house among the stars meant so much to Bill and me in terms of our translations as a whole. Of the changes from one generation to the next that Tremblay traces in the play, Lockerbie writes, "The correspondence between these changes and the sociological changes they chart chime closely with those of the Scottish experience. Bill Findlay is fascinated by these connections. The play has strong echoes of the Scottish experience with regard to displacement, he says, pointing out that the play is dealing with a move away from roots in linguistic, geographical, social, and even metaphysical senses. Indeed, the multiple processes mirrored in the lives of the translators themselves. Findlay's recent family moved from rootedness in rural Banffshire to Central Belt working class, Bowman's from rural Angus to Montreal working class. Both recognize within themselves this 20th century deracination. Bill and I had the extraordinary good luck to meet each other, and thanks to Michel Tremblay, we could make something of what was in our hearts. Of course, Tremblay was not only telling the story of his own family, he was telling the story of Quebec, his place, and putting it on the map of the world. And in this extraordinary play, so lyrical, so daring, so heartbreaking, so true, he was telling Scotland's story too.
Thank you. That was great. And I think Jane Custas will have a response for 10 minutes to all of this. Jane, are you still here?
Yes. I am here. I'm turning off my video, however. It's pleased to see you, Martin. I have a very unstable internet connection, and I have been advised by the team that it is better when I turn off the video, so I shall do so. And I apologize for coming across as a sort of disembodied voice. It reminds me of my work on Robert Lepage. Anyway, at that point, I will stop. Thank you so very, very much for that fascinating presentation, and of course, the wonderful books. I think what comes through in your talk is your approach to these translations, the passion that you brought into it against, I would say, many odds. I mean, from what I understand, it was frequently complicated and time-consuming to try to get these plays on stage. The research you put into it, and also your fundamental understanding of the situation of Quebec, because I think that's to translate Michel Tremblay, you have to understand the relationship between the language, the identity, the nation, all of that comes through very, very strongly in your work. And as I said, your admirable approach to it. I've done some work on Irish theater as well. There's an Irish translation of Michel Tremblay's Les Bergères, The Unmanageable Sisters by Deirdre Kinahan, and that is an adaptation. So I find your argument for a translation adaptation also very compelling. I think one can make arguments on both sides, but Deirdre Kinahan was very limited because she had to work with the Van Buren and Glasgow translation. She could not manage with the Quebec, well, the printed version of in joual. And I found it fascinating that you always said that you started with a literal translation. I'm wondering to what extent you did at some point go back to the Glasgow and Van Buren translation just for comparison, maybe even out of curiosity. But she, of course, was bound by that, and she actually regrets that. It would have been, she would have preferred to have been able to translate, to do a literal translation, as in fact you did. I think, too, the comparisons you made between Quebec and Scotland, one can say about Ireland as well, the issue of obviously a colonized nation, Ireland being a colonization, the issue of language, because of course the Irish language very much threatened. The Catholic Church, perhaps presence in Ireland a little bit more predominantly, and also the idea too of language and identity being linked, but also I think too, and this is what you stress as well, that literature or theater is being part of the identity of a nation. To strengthen the language, to strengthen the literature is also obviously to strengthen the link between, to strengthen the political aspect too. And of course, Ireland, like Quebec and like Scotland, has had its issues of self-government, etc. So these arguments are all very much there. I think when you discuss the language register, I think that this comes across as very, very important, and the different language registers. I think that this is central, and it's something, for example, in Albertine en 5 tons, or in the Maison Suspendue, sorry, the house in the sky. This is something very, very central to it, that you have these, and also in those differences, you get the conflicts too, right? The rural versus the urban, the educated versus the somewhat less educated, or the working class versus somebody who has had some education. That comes, I'm thinking of in the and Les Belles Sœurs, when they criticize the young child, I can't remember his name because he's speaking Latin at home, so that's kind of obviously not welcome. So I think this idea of the language register is extremely interesting, and the musicality of the plays as well, that you were able to keep that in mind and to get that through. And Michel Tremblay does talk about that this is important. It's not just the language register or the use of slang or whatever, but it's also the musicality of the language. And I think that that's a vital part of it that clearly you and Bill were aware of, on which you very much focused. I think it's interesting that you translated La Maison Suspendue, House Among the Stars, and The Solemn Mass, because these plays, as you say, were not particularly successful in Quebec. And it's interesting that they were very successful in Scots. I think that's something, I don't know if it's because of some sort of time lag or cultural difference or whatever, but I think that that's a very interesting point that you make in the book. I'm wondering too about the selection of plays. I'm sure you did struggle with this. I'm thinking of Hosanna as well, which is of course an important play, but it does have its controversies, and it brings to the stage a very, very difficult topic at the time. I think too that you had to be very much aware of the cultural sensitivity of the audience. This was not something that was necessarily going to be easily accepted. So I think that the selection of the plays is, I think, very interesting, something obviously on which you and Bill spent a great deal of attention. The notion too of these plays in Scots traveling beyond Scotland, I think is extremely intriguing. That the Guid Sisters was staged in Toronto, others were staged in the States, etc. And somehow they still had resonance there, which speaks to obviously the universality of Tremblay's plays, but somehow this worked elsewhere, which I think is fascinating too. I think too what you say about the idea that you were willing, and this is the notion of the translation rather than the adaptation, you were willing to challenge the audience, that they could in fact somehow make the jump from it being staged in Glasgow. Deirdre Kinahan's Unmanageable Sisters is staged in Dublin. They could somehow make the jump from it being staged in Glasgow to be in fact happening in Quebec, even with this very, very obvious Scottish, I'm not going to say with the Scottish, I was going to say overlay, but that's not the correct word, but this recasting, shall we say, the Scottish recasting. So I think that the fact that you were willing to challenge the audience at a time when that clearly was not typical, that, as you said, this is one of the first. I think that that's a very important aspect of your work. I think too, and I'd like you to perhaps talk about this a little bit too, that Tremblay was also, as I understand, impressed by what you were doing, and that you did in fact, you were in contact with him. I was going to say work with him, but you certainly were in contact with him. And I think that that's a very interesting aspect of your work too. And somehow you, I'm sure, were in contact with him about his, I remember you mentioned in one of the upcoming, you talked about an upcoming play. So I think that worked as well with your selection. So yes, I think too, the effort that you put into, especially Bill Findlay put into the precision of the language. This I think is important. You mentioned, I think people are aware of this, as later in Tremblay's career, he wasn't focused as much on the phonetic pronunciation in what we see in the published text, and he could count on his actors or actresses to produce the kind of the joual without it having been spelled out. Deirdre Kinahan in her work, The Unmanageable Sisters, does the same thing. But you and Bill in particular, had to really, really, as you just mentioned, focus on that, because it could easily slip into something a bit more bland or universal or mixed up, I would say, is probably more confused. So I think that that's something that you very much, the emphasis on that is very, very important. So yes, I think the selection, as I said, is interesting. The difficulties that you present. And also, I have not yet, maybe I will compare this to the John Van Buren and Bill Glasgow translations, but I think it's the notion too of collaboration, you focusing with your background on Montreal and with his obviously expertise in the languages. It's produced an absolutely astonishing body of work. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Jane. And now perhaps we can hear from Janusz.
Do we let Martin to react to this first reaction? Or
Sure, if you'd like to react.
Okay, me? Right. Okay. Yeah. The one of the things that Jane mentioned is the choice of the plays. The plays were mostly chosen by us in that order. We did have a lot of say, especially at the beginning when we were doing this. We didn't have to worry about productions because there wasn't any. So we the choice of Les Belles-Sœurs was obviously it had to be that. With, as I pointed out in my talk today, because it had so many resonances with between Montreal and Glasgow, between Quebec theatre and Scottish theatre and so on. It did take a good 11 years. I don't know if I emphasized that enough. That we were waiting for the production. So in the meantime, we'd gone ahead and considered other plays that we would like to translate. I think at one point we were getting a bit disheartened, and so Bill said, well, maybe we should translate somebody else while we're waiting for somebody to come along and produce the Tremblays. And so I suggested to him a play by Antonine Maillet, the Acadian writer, a play called La Contrebandière, the smuggler lass, she would have been called in Scots. We discussed the play. I did some work on it. It has a happy ending, and that was the end of that. When Bill wrote back to me, he said, I think the play's okay, and I trust your judgment, but I really don't like the happy ending. So that sent us back to Tremblay, where the endings are not happy in most cases. So we didn't hesitate with Forever Yours, Marie-Lou. We wanted to do that before we ever got anywhere, because it was so. It's one of his greatest plays. I think we both felt, and an absolutely overwhelming tragedy, and somehow the way in which the whole setup with the time and all the things that Tremblay is a master of are all to be found in that play. So those were the plays that we wanted to do on our own. And Michel then, of course, was major in getting us to do the House Among the Stars, as we called La Maison Suspendue, because he was working on it in Paris, as I recount in the book. Of course, those of you who've read it, he brought the first draft of La Maison Suspendue to Glasgow, because he attended the premiere of the Guid Sisters in Glasgow. Which is something that I was unable to do. I was working in Montreal, teaching away, but I did get to see it later in the run. So he brought us La Maison Suspendue, and so right away we saw that this, in a way, was the play we were waiting for. And I put it that way because it's the one that's set in 3 times, and so it allows for rural Scots, it allows for the more angry urban Scots, it allows for Scottish English, and it also has fiddle music in it. One of the main characters in the 1910 section is a fiddler, and so this is another resonance between Quebec and Scotland. Obviously, the fiddle music of Quebec is linked to the Irish-Scottish tradition. One other thing, just I don't want to take up too much time, but the issue of adaptation versus translation, I have no position on this one way or the other in terms of any other translations. But for us, it absolutely had to be it had to be translation and not adaptation, for the simple reason that we both recognize that if we set it in Scotland, even if there would be some partial adaptations would be possible, but we wanted to be rigorous and not have anything at all, because we did not want to erase Quebec from the play. It would be a cultural erasure for me, as somebody who's from Montreal and who's loved going to French theater and everything in my life. I couldn't bear the idea of using the play as a device for something else. I'm not saying all adaptation is that at all. I'm not making any statement whatsoever, and I want to be clear about that. But for us, it had to be this way. So we only had the subtlest kind of techniques from time to time that nobody watching the play would understand. I mean, in Le Vrai Monde, the real world, there are references to Drummondville and Sept-Îles and Sorel and maybe Trois-Rivières and so on. So we would just slip in a line like, well, it's 50 miles to Sorel, so that the audience in Scotland could have some idea of what kind of distances, because going to Sorel is one thing, going to Sept-Îles is another kind of thing. So we did explain things, but we did it without adaptation. And we felt that we were doing something for Scotland, but we were also, I was very conscious that, and so was Bill, of course, too, of wanting to keep Montreal and all, and of course all of the architecture of Montreal and all the outside staircases in solemn mass. And what are you going to do when you get rid of all of that stuff? This is not on what Jane was saying, but I want to mention that Albertine Sancton and Solemn Mass are now both operas, and they both premiered last year. Well, Solemn Mass premiered this summer, so the musical form. So on the adaptation, and the question of universality and particularity, the great thing about Tremblay is that the particularity is universal, at least in the right setting. Certainly when you go to Scotland. About the plays playing elsewhere and being successful. Well, Michel went to see the Guid Sisters in Scotland. He also saw it at the Centaur Theatre in Montreal. But his comment was that he could tell it was a good translation because of the audience response and the laughter and so on and so on. Although he felt he couldn't really understand much of the quick patter of the performers. But the big surprise was Toronto, where the Guid Sisters played at Harbourfront at the festival without any blinking of the eye of the critics. But some years later, there was a Canadian production of Hosanna. It's the only time that we've had a non-Scottish production, and the only time we've ever had a non-Scot actor in a play. And the Toronto critics were quite puzzled. They didn't get it. It was a one-time only when we had, they liked the production. They thought the play was interesting. Of course, they already knew Hosanna as a play, but they really just said, well, there's no point to this. To do this in Scots, and maybe there isn't as much in Toronto, but it was a unique moment of questioning the whole enterprise.
Thank you.
Thanks very, very much. Thank you.
Yeah. Janusz, you'd like to talk?
First of all, thank you very much for organizing this talk and giving us this extraordinary opportunity to talk about this translation, very famous since a long time. I remember when I was a student at McGill and working on my PhD on Quebec theatre, one of the first things I heard was Scottish translations, was kind of sensation at this 90s. So I'm glad that at some point I can now complete my, I would say, formation and talk directly to the translator. I have a lot of questions. Thank you, Martin, first of all, for explaining all the context, which is very important, and explaining also how close these two societies are related in terms of politics, history, language, and so on. I appreciate also the fact that you mentioned where the issues arise inevitably. But overall, we could say that you, Quebec, and Scotland and Tremblay, it's like perfect mixed, actually. Should be used as an exception, but also as a model for translators, literary translators. And at some point, we could say so many pieces, I would say, fit together that it looks like it's almost a perfect word for translation, but maybe too perfect in the way that actually, for sure, there are differences and there are challenges and issues that are related to this kind of work. It happens that this term I teach Quebec literature, and last week we started to talk about Tremblay, and we will study actually À trois pour toujours ta Malulu, next week. So this is a great opportunity for students also. I base my question on two critical texts that I'm using in this class, so students can relate directly to what they are learning. One is the study by Lise Gauvin in her book called L'Engagement, in which he reserved a chapter for Michel Tremblay, and this chapter, the title is Le Théâtre de Michel Tremblay, Le Théâtre de Michel Tremblay. And in this article, he points out 5 functions that joual plays in Michel Tremblay theatre. So these functions are, first of all, realistic one. He started to write in joual because he wanted to give exact representation of Quebec society. The second one, it was also political dimension of this decision. So there was like a political action behind this. The third one, he wanted to actually, as you said very well, he wanted to, by exploring a local situation, to actually continue a universal literary tradition of using vernacular language. And he mentioned by himself Tennessee Williams as one of the writers that he did it, actually. And the fourth function was that his theater he sees as actually perfectly not only universal, but exportable. And finally, he want to also make a point about the real function that he wanted to reserve for joual in his theater. So my first set of questions relates to these 5 functions, actually. Because let's talk about the realistic representation of Scottish society by your translation. And you said already that there is some problem with the fact that not only one dialect, but they are dialects, but there is no norms, exactly as in Quebec. But I was also wondering if, because if I understand, as I understand, you are born and you're in Montreal and you learn Scottish in Quebec, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm wondering because some critics talk about Tremblay joual, le joual de Tremblay. I was wondering how the fact that you are born in Quebec and learn Scottish in Quebec eventually influenced your translation. There's any Bowman Scottish in this translation? The first question. The second question is about political dimension of his decision of using joual. So we know that it was kind of like a bomb, a scandal. I don't have impression that that was the same effect in Scotland for many reasons. Probably because if I'm right, there is already Scottish literary tradition, and probably Scottish theatre tradition. So it wasn't like something for the first time that people heard people speaking Scottish in Scottish theatre. So to what extent this identification, this easy identification, a very positive identification of Scottish public was political? This is my second question. And as for the third question, actually, you mentioned this already. Thank you, Jane, for mentioning this aspect. It's about success and possibility to export your translation in other countries, English-speaking countries, of course, and to what extent it can be exportable. And the final question, the fifth question, is about the role that Tremblay wanted to reserve for joual in his theatre. And surprisingly for everybody, he said that it wasn't his first goal to shock people by using joual in his theatre. He wanted just, as I said at the beginning of this comment, he wanted just to make a realistic representation of Quebec society. So he, I would say, contradicted the fact that the joual is the main character of his theatre, which with Le Belser it became actually the main character. of his representation. So I guess it's not the case in the way your translation has been received in Scotland. And the other sub question that is related to this also is about I would say, the role the Scottish plays in Scottish society. In Quebec, some people say that it serves of how this escape value or salvation value. It has a dimension that is not only cultural, but more than this, almost existential. And I was wondering if Scottish in Scotland plays a similar role. So this is my first question. Hopefully I will have a chance to ask you other questions.
Maybe not. There's a lot of questions for Martin.
Well, it's very. I've made little notes to try to, because there's 5 questions, I think, and I'm not sure I'm going to answer them as answers to particular questions. But I'll make a few comments, and then Janusz can come back and ask for further clarification if he would wish. First of all, about my own Scots, the fact that my parents were Scots speakers, and that they lived in a fairly closed-off Scottish society within all the different groups that were living in Verdun, where I grew up, working-class neighborhood. And my parents and their friends, all but one of whom there were a group of maybe 16 people, 8 or 9 couples. There was one Canadian and one English person. All the others were Scots. And they had these parties, and I was the baby of the family. So when my sister refused to babysit for me, I was taken off, and and my parents spoke Scots among themselves too. So I learned it that way. Like anybody else who has parents from another country, I learned my language is the English of Verdun, of the English-speaking community, but I learned Scots. I did influence Bill from time to time when there would be a discussion about a given word or whatever. So I wouldn't say I was an equal partner in those discussions, but it was pretty close. And Bill always treated me as if I was an equal partner in our discussions about Scots. So, but in terms of particular Angus words or whatever, the Angus being where my parents came from, probably not. It's just my general knowledge of Scots was there so that I could be contributing. This wasn't just a cross-cultural thing with one person totally immersed in the one place and the other person. I was from both. I mean, I've always felt, there's no question, I always felt that I was Scottish. I wasn't sure if I was Canadian for a long time, and I eventually figured out that I was Canadian too, and also a Quebecer. Above all, I would say I'm very, very, and perhaps it's because my parents were Scottish and because of the parallels that I became very much, my sense of being being a Quebecer was part of it. For everyone's Marie-Lou, an interesting comment about its political dimension. And I discovered, and I mentioned it in my book, how Tremblay, in the program, eventually, it's the first of a trilogy, and the other, called La Trilogie de Brassard, because the family name, amusingly enough, of this terrible tragedy is Brassard, who of course was also the director and friend of Michel. Must have been a little joke on Michel's part that he named that family Brassard. Anyway, he had a quotation in the program when I think it was in the early 1990s, La Trilogie de Brassard was on at the Théâtre d'Aujourd'hui in Montreal, and the quotation is that I determined. This was in 1970 when all the political things were going on in Quebec. I determined to put a bomb. That's the word he used, to put a bomb under the Quebec family. I decided that I would blow up the Quebec family in this play. And then he describes the two daughters as representing 2 ways of being after this demolition. One would be a person who became completely immersed in the future and rejected the past, and the other would be someone who would be completely drowning in the past and refusing to let go of it. So certainly that the political atmosphere of the time had a direct effect on Tremblay's thinking about that play. and now I'm looking at the exportability of these plays. I don't think we ever really cared. We didn't do it for any other place but Scotland. So all the rest of it was sort of, whatever that expression is. It was just very delightful for me as a Montrealer that it played at the Centaur Theatre and that the British government paid for the production as the 350th anniversary of the city of Montreal at that time. That was really lovely. That the Guid Sisters was a hit in Toronto, and even very surprisingly, showing our own ideas about different places. But I was surprised that the American audience in New York State at the festival there would embrace the play as much. This was Le Vrai Monde, the real world, as much as they did. And the plays played in London. That would be the one place beyond Scotland that we would think would be a place where it would be possible for the plays to get a footing. And they did. There have been 3 productions taken. One production was done in London, and 2 productions that traveled there. But it was not really our concern. This is a simple act of taking something and doing it with a political motive within Scotland. And I'm losing my track of some of these other points that I should be addressing. The question about the existential element of the play. Well, first of all, I think Tremblay got hoist with his own petard when he did Les Belles Sœurs, because he says this other thing about Les Belles Sœurs, that it wasn't really meant to be a manifesto for vernacular language. That wasn't his overall purpose, but he couldn't help it. It was such a shock when the play opened. It was such a shock on the stages of Montreal, and some of the critics, if you read them now, I mean, they're in a state of absolute disgust that these kinds of people are being shown on the stage. So he couldn't help it. He had the brilliant idea, and even though his motivation may have been more towards just a realistic representation of his world, he couldn't avoid the succès du scandale that happened with that play. And so what were we doing with were we dropping a bomb on the Scottish theatre, you asked, Janusz? And without going too far, I think Bill and I thought we were. What we were doing was saying, you don't have to adapt. The culture is strong enough; it can take it. I mean, we can make an example of Chekhov or something, and we go to a play in English or any other language, and we see it. We know it's in Russian. We have no problem with that. But so I saw a production of The Three Sisters in Scotland, but it had been adapted to a Scottish country home. It was up in the Highlands somewhere, and that's fine. It worked okay as a play, but it's disconnected, and it's this. The phrase I'd like to put into the discussion, I may have said it already earlier, is cultural erasure, if that's the way you pronounce it. The erasing of a culture by completely taking a product of that culture and turning it into another culture without. I mean, it's not something that I can imagine for our work. I can see the point, and the Unmanageable Sisters apparently was. Not apparently, was a great success, and it worked very well in the Irish context, and I'm not part of that context, so I really can't have any opinion. But if you take the last of the plays that Tremblay of Tremblay that Bill and I translated, it is his autobiographical play, Encore une fois, si vous me permettez, or si vous le permettez. The title then was changed to Encore une fois, si vous permettez. And it has 3 different titles in its 2 translations and the original. Linda Gaborio chose to give it the title For the Pleasure of Seeing Her Again, and Bowman and Findlay chose to call it If Only. Now, these titles are very different, but all 3 of the titles come from one paragraph, one speech in the play, said by the narrator. It's an autobiographical play. It's a play about Montreal in the last days of colonialism, in the days before it became great metropolis in the world, of a Quebec that is completely closed off from its roots in terms of French culture, and it's an utterly autobiographical play about Michel and his mother called Nana, and he calls himself the narrator. And I've got a long chapter in my introduction, and of course I don't have to go on about it, but it's Nana talks only about stuff that hasn't anything to do with Quebec, because there is no Quebec. There's a mention of hockey, and there's a mention of snow, but otherwise it's Russian theater, and it's all the other parts of it. This amazing romantic novel from France, 1875, and this huge discussion about blue bloods and so on that goes on. And for Tremblay, it was a book that he read himself. This play is very much autobiographical, and he himself. He places the chapter about Patira, this book, just before the chapter about Bonheur d'Occasion, the play by Gabriel Roy, which the novel rather, which completely changed his life and made him realize so much about he writes very eloquently about what it was like to live in a small culture and to be far away in America and all of those things and it was his breakout moment for what he could do himself. I'm rambling a bit, but I don't know whether I've answered other points that I've missed.
I think that's great. We could take
just the one last thing, the existential aspect of it. The critics observed this. They felt that they talk about Tremblay being a great melancholy realist and going on about the way in which he's examining those aspects of life that we might call existential. So yes, that came through. It came through in the critical response that we got in Scotland.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you. Perhaps we have time for one question for the audience. If someone would like to ask a question in the question box, or because I don't think attendees have the discussion or chat function. Would anyone have a question to ask? Oh, yes. Wonderful. So we have Judith Woodsworth in the chat congratulating you on assembling these plays in 2 volumes, and who asks, what is the legacy in Scotland today? Is Tremblay still a sensation?
Hi, Judith, and thanks for the question. It's stalled, I would say. Scotland has moved on to other things, and I mentioned the idea of the curatorial aspect of these plays, and that here's 8 plays. There was one other plays we did, but these are the ones that are known, which are a way showing what Scots can be and is as a theatrical language, and all that has happened since Bill died in 2003, was the 2012 revival of the Guid Sisters. That would be 23 years after the first production in 1989 in Glasgow. This was at the Royal Lyceum Theatre in Edinburgh. An interesting thing about it was that the theatre engaged Serge Denoncourt, the well-known Quebec director, to direct the production. It was extremely well received at the time. Since then, there's been one production of If Only in London, a very small but a professional production. Some people have expressed the hope to me that these books will spark an interest, and that perhaps we may get to see some future productions. But for me, the publication of these books is most significant as the legacy that is created. 5 of these plays were not published before, and it's clear that this Tremblay phenomenon was an extraordinary event in Scottish history and recognized as such, and bless the Association for Scottish Literature for taking on the mammoth job of publishing them. It's not a joke publishing a play. It's a complicated thing, and the books are physically beautiful. I must say that they did a marvelous job. So not any real legacy yet, but it's a nice idea to imagine productions again. I haven't made any effort to contact theaters and remind them of this, but I may yet do that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to you, Martin, and to Jane and to Janusz as well. It is time for this event to end, unfortunately. So I think I'll let Aurelia maybe say a few words to close the event.
Thank you so much, Nicole, and to everybody, Jane and Janusz and Aurelia.
Oh, yes, thank you so much to all of you. The conversation was simply too short. I would love to listen even more. So thank you very much for your presence and your generosity, for sharing your work with us. And we hope we can organize something else in the future. And I would like to advertise the 2 volumes of your book. It's a really amazing experience of reading Tremblay in Scottish. Of course, I can't understand everything, but actually I was surprised to be able to grasp general meaning. So thank you so much. This is a very interesting experience. Thank you again, and hope to see you soon.
Much, Aurelia.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks to everyone. Thanks to the
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.